It was a crisp autumn morning in a small town just outside Atlanta. The leaves, fiery in shades of orange and red, fluttered down the sidewalks as the townsfolk went about their routines. The local grocery store, Bennett's Market, was bustling with activity. Shoppers filled their carts with fresh produce, bread, and canned goods, their chatter mingling with the soft hum of the store's air conditioning. Among the crowd was Marcus Ellis, a tall black man in his late 30s. Marcus had recently moved to the town for a new job as a community counselor, hoping to start afresh after leaving the chaotic city life behind. He was a man of quiet strength, his calm demeanor masking the struggles he had faced throughout his life. With a list in one hand and a basket in the other, Marcus navigated the aisles, selecting items for his week ahead. As Marcus reached for a carton of milk, he heard a sharp voice behind him. "Excuse me, but you're blocking the way," the woman said. He turned to see an elderly white woman, her face pinched with irritation. She wore a perfectly pressed dress, a pearl necklace, and an air of superiority that was impossible to miss. "Sorry about that," Marcus said politely, stepping aside. The woman didn't move immediately. Instead, she studied Marcus with a critical eye, her gaze lingering a moment too long. She pursed her lips, as though tasting something bitter. "Haven't seen you around here before," she said, her tone sharp. "I'm new in town," Marcus replied, offering a faint smile before turning back to the shelf. The woman sniffed disdainfully. Well, I suppose anyone can move here these days." Marcus chose to ignore the comment, though it stung more than he cared to admit. He focused on his list, trying to keep his composure. But as he moved to the produce section, the woman appeared again, her presence as unwelcome as a storm cloud. This time, her words were loud enough for nearby shoppers to hear. "Why don't you stick to your kind?" she snapped, her voice dripping with venom. "You don't belong in decent places like this." The store fell silent. Marcus froze, his heart pounding as her words echoed in his ears. Other shoppers exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to react. Some pretended not to notice, quickly turning their attention back to their shopping carts. Marcus slowly turned to face her, his jaw tight. He wanted to respond, to stand up for himself, but years of experiencing moments like this had taught him to pick his battles carefully. He clenched his fists, feeling the weight of every set of eyes in the store on him. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "I'm just here to buy groceries like everyone else." The woman scoffed. "Groceries? Sure, but I doubt you even know what to do with half of this food. People like you don't appreciate things the way we do." Anger flared in Marcus, but he swallowed it down. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the urge to shout, to demand respect. Instead, he met her gaze with a calm that belied his fury. "I don't think it's your place to judge what I do or don't appreciate." Before she could respond, a younger white woman nearby stepped in. She was in her late 20s, with a toddler in her cart. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said firmly, her eyes blazing, "but you're out of line." The older woman turned to her, incredulous. "Out of line? I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking." "No," the younger woman said, her voice unwavering. "You're saying what you're thinking, and it's hateful. You don't speak for everyone here." A murmur of agreement rippled through the store as more shoppers began to voice their disapproval. Emboldened by their support, Marcus stood a little taller. The older woman's face turned red, whether from anger or embarrassment. It was hard to tell. "You people think you can just come in and take over," the older woman muttered, grabbing her cart and pushing it toward the checkout line. As she stormed off, Marcus let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The younger woman turned to him with an apologetic smile. "I'm so sorry you had to deal with that," she said. "Thank you," Marcus replied, his voice softer now. "I appreciate you standing up for me." The moment passed, and the store gradually returned to its usual rhythm. But for Marcus, the incident lingered like a shadow, a reminder of the prejudice that still existed even in the most mundane places. Later that evening, as Marcus unpacked his groceries in his modest apartment, he thought about the encounter. He thought about the young woman who had spoken up, about the silence of most of the other shoppers, and about the anger he had swallowed down. He wondered if this was just the beginning of what he would face in this new town. But Marcus also knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let hatred define his life. He had come here for a fresh start, and he intended to see it through. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of pink and purple, Marcus resolved to push forward. He wasn't just here for himself. He was here to make a difference, to show people like that woman that he did belong not just in the grocery store, but anywhere he chose to be. The days following the grocery store incident felt heavy for Marcus. Though he tried to focus on his new role as a community counselor, the memory of the old woman's words clung to him like a stubborn shadow. He replayed the moment in his mind, questioning if he could have handled it differently, but Marcus was not one to dwell on negativity for long. He had always believed in the power of actions over words, and he threw himself into his work with renewed determination. His office, a small but welcoming space in the local community center, quickly became a hub for residents seeking advice, comfort, or a listening ear. One Friday afternoon, as Marcus prepared to wrap up his day, a knock on his office door pulled his attention. A young boy of about 10 stepped in, his backpack slung over one shoulder. His face was a mix of curiosity and hesitation. "Hi there," Marcus said warmly, gesturing for the boy to sit. "What's your name?" "Elliot," the boy replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nice to meet you, Elliot. How can I help you today?" The boy fidgeted with the straps of his backpack, his eyes darting around the room. Finally, he blurted, "My grandma doesn't like you." The words hit Marcus like a slap, though he kept his expression neutral. He had learned over the years that children often spoke with unfiltered honesty. "Your grandma?" Marcus asked gently. Elliot nodded, his small face clouded with guilt. "She said you don't belong here." "But I don't think that's true." A wave of emotions washed over Marcus: anger, sadness, and an unexpected flicker of hope. Here was a child raised in a household of prejudice, questioning what he had been taught. "Well, Elliot," Marcus said after a moment, "what do you think?" The boy hesitated, then shrugged. "I think you seem nice. And my mom said it wasn't okay for grandma to yell at you in the store." Marcus smiled at the mention of the young woman who had defended him. "Your mom sounds like a smart woman." Elliot nodded vigorously. "She says people should be treated the same, no matter what." "That's a good lesson," Marcus said. "And you know what? Sometimes grown-ups don't always get it right, but it's brave of you to come here and talk to me about it." The boy's face lit up with a small smile. "I wanted to say sorry for what she said. It wasn't nice." "Thank you, Elliot," Marcus replied, his voice sincere. "That means a lot to me." The two talked for a while longer, their conversation shifting to lighter topics like school and favorite sports teams. By the time Elliot left, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. If a child like Elliot could begin to unlearn the prejudices passed down to him, there was hope for change. But not everyone in town shared Elliot's openness. Over the next few weeks, Marcus began noticing small, unsettling signs that his presence wasn't welcomed by everyone. At first, it was subtle: cold stares from certain shopkeepers, whispered comments as he walked by. One morning, Marcus found his car spray painted with slurs. The sight of the hateful words scrawled across his vehicle made his stomach churn. He stood there, fists clenched, as neighbors passed by. Some looked away awkwardly, pretending not to see, while others murmured in sympathy but kept their distance. It wasn't until Sheriff Tom Caldwell, the town's lawman, pulled up that anyone approached Marcus directly. Sheriff Caldwell was a grizzled man in his 60s with a reputation for fairness. He stepped out of his cruiser, his boots crunching on the gravel driveway. "Morning, Marcus," Caldwell said, tipping his hat. "I heard about the vandalism. Mind if I take a look?" "Be my guest," Marcus replied, stepping aside. Caldwell examined the car with a frown. "This is unacceptable," he muttered. "Do you have any idea who might have done it?" Marcus shook his head. "No, but I'm guessing it's someone who doesn't want me here." The sheriff sighed, scratching his chin. "I'll look into it. In the meantime, you let me know if anything else happens, all right?" "Thanks, Sheriff." As Caldwell drove off, Marcus grabbed a bucket and sponge, determined to clean the hateful graffiti himself. A few minutes into the task, a car pulled up, and Elliot's mom, the young woman from the store, stepped out. "Marcus," she called, her face tight with concern. "I heard what happened. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," he replied, though his voice betrayed his weariness. She frowned, then glanced at the sponge in his hand. "You shouldn't have to clean this up alone. Let me help." Before Marcus could protest, she grabbed a second sponge from her trunk and began scrubbing the paint off his car. They worked in silence for a while, the awkwardness of the situation hanging in the air. Finally, she spoke. "I don't understand why some people can't just let others live their lives. You're one of the kindest people I've met." And yet, she trailed off, her voice tinged with frustration. "It's not new to me," Marcus admitted, "but it doesn't make it any easier." By the time the car was clean, Marcus felt a small sense of relief, not because the graffiti was gone, but because someone had stood by him, offering support in a tangible way. As the woman drove off, Marcus couldn't help but wonder what other challenges lay ahead. He knew he wasn't just fighting for his own place in this town. He was challenging deeply rooted prejudices that had festered for generations. The fight wouldn't be easy, but Marcus was determined to keep going, for himself and for the Elliots of the world who deserved a future free from hate. The incident with the spray-painted slurs became a turning point for Marcus. He'd dealt with racism before, but this felt different, more personal, more pointed. It wasn't just anonymous hate, it was a message, one that said he wasn't welcome in this town, no matter how much good he tried to do. But Marcus refused to be cowed. He had a job to do, and he wasn't about to let the actions of a few bigots dictate his life. He poured his energy into his work, meeting with community leaders, offering counseling sessions, and speaking at local schools. Slowly but surely, he started to earn the respect of those willing to listen. Despite this, the undercurrent of hostility persisted. In the weeks following the vandalism, Marcus found himself avoiding certain areas of town, noticing the cold stares that followed him wherever he went. The grocery store where he'd first encountered the old woman became a place he dreaded. He tried to shop at odd hours, hoping to avoid confrontation, but it wasn't always possible. One afternoon, as he entered the store, he immediately felt the weight of judgment in the air. He kept his head down, making his way toward the dairy section. But as he turned the corner, he nearly collided with a man who was browsing the eggs. "Oh, sorry," Marcus muttered, stepping back. The man, in his early 40s with a scruffy beard, didn't respond right away. He just looked at Marcus, sizing him up, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Marcus felt the familiar tension in the air, the silent disapproval that hung between them like a fog. "It's fine," the man finally said, his tone flat. He didn't move away, just stood there, blocking Marcus's path. For a second, neither man spoke. Then, the man let out a small laugh, almost like a nervous chuckle. "You know, I saw what happened to your car." Marcus blinked, surprised by the acknowledgement. "You did?" "Yeah," the man said, his gaze shifting uncomfortably. "I didn't think anyone would do something like that in a place like this." "It's not right." Marcus raised an eyebrow. He wasn't sure where this conversation was going, but he wasn't about to get his hopes up. "I appreciate that," he said, his voice guarded, "but I'm not sure how much it helps coming from someone who didn't stop it." The man's eyes flashed with irritation. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean," Marcus replied, his tone steady, "if you knew it was happening, why didn't you say something? Why didn't you step up?" The man bristled, his hands tightening around the egg carton in his grip. "You don't know anything about me," he said, his voice growing tense. You don't know what I've done." Marcus studied him for a moment. There was something in the man's eyes, a flicker of something. Shame, maybe, or guilt. But Marcus didn't have the time to analyze it. "I don't need to know," Marcus said, his words firm but calm. "What matters is what you do now. It's never too late to do the right thing." The man's face twisted in frustration, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he dropped the carton of eggs into his basket and walked away without another word. Marcus watched him go, a mixture of disappointment and resignation filling his chest. Another opportunity for change. Wasted. He had hoped for it, something more, a conversation, and a lie, but in the end, the silence spoke volumes. He wasn't surprised. There were far more people like the man who had chosen to look the other way, and they were the ones who allowed the hate to fester unchecked. He finished his shopping in silence, pushing his cart through the aisles without encountering anyone else he knew. When he reached the checkout, the cashier, a young man with a tired smile, greeted him in silence, ringing up his items without looking him in the eye. As Marcus grabbed his bags, he glanced around the store once more. It was a familiar feeling, the sense that he didn't belong, that he was somehow out of place. But this time, it didn't hurt as much. He had learned to live with it, even if it was something he would never fully accept. On his way home, Marcus thought about the man in the store. He wondered if, deep down, there was a part of him that was struggling with his own beliefs, his own biases. It was a painful thought, but it was the truth. People didn't change overnight, and if Marcus was going to make a difference, he would have to meet people where they were, even if it meant facing more silence, more resistance. That evening, as he sat on his couch, Marcus reflected on his role in this town. He wasn't here to force change, but to encourage it, gently and persistently. And while there were days when the weight of the world seemed too much to bear, he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't stop. Not now, not ever. The following days brought more of the same subtle encounters, with people who avoided eye contact or muttered under their breath as he passed. But there were moments, small and fleeting, that gave him hope. A smile from a stranger on the street, a nod of acknowledgement from someone he had helped. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him going. Despite everything, Marcus kept his head high. He wasn't just going to let this town change him. He was here to change it, one step at a time. The days turned into weeks, and Marcus found himself growing, accustomed to the subtle hostility that lingered in the air. It was almost as if the town was holding its breath, waiting for him to make a mistake, a reason to justify their prejudices. But Marcus didn't let it break in. Every day, he pushed forward, focusing on his work and doing his best to engage with the community. One Tuesday evening, Marcus received an invitation that caught him by surprise. It was a flyer slipped under his door, inviting him to a town hall meeting hosted by the mayor. The flyer was simple, but the message was clear. Join us in discussing the future of our town. Everyone's voice matters. At first, Marcus was skeptical. He had seen enough to know that these types of meetings often served as little more than a formality, a way for the town's power brokers to pat themselves on the back while avoiding real change. But something about the invitation stirred something inside him. Maybe, just maybe, this was an opportunity to make a real impact. That evening, Marcus walked into the community center, where the meeting was being held. The room was packed with people, local business owners, school teachers, and a few families who had lived in the town for generations. The air was thick with the hum of conversation, but as soon as Marcus entered, the room seemed to grow a little quieter. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him as he made his way to an empty seat in the back. The mayor, a middle-aged man named Bill Harper, took the stage after a few minutes. He was the kind of politician who had a smile for everyone but said very little of substance. His rhetoric was polished, his words rehearsed. As he began speaking, Marcus listened closely, waiting for any hint that this meeting would be more than just talk. "Good evening, everyone," Mayor Harper began, his voice smooth and practiced. "Thank you all for being here tonight. We've gathered to discuss the future of this great town, and I believe that with your input, we can make it even better." There were a few scattered nods of approval from the audience, but Marcus could tell that many were already disengaged. They had heard this kind of speech before. The issues we'll address tonight include infrastructure, education, and of course, community development, Mayor Harper continued. But before we dive into the specifics, I'd like to open the floor to anyone who wishes to speak. This is your chance to be heard. A murmur rippled through the room as people shifted in their seats, waiting for someone to take the first step. Marcus took a deep breath. He had been thinking about this for a while, thinking about the way people in this town treated him and others like him. It was time to speak up. He raised his hand, and to his surprise, the mayor nodded toward him. The room fell silent as Marcus stood, his heart racing. "My name is Marcus Ellis," he began, his voice steady. "I'm new to this town, and I've been working here for a few months now as a community counselor. But lately, I've been noticing something that I think needs to be addressed." The room seemed to tense, the mood shifting. Marcus could feel the weight of the crowd's attention on him, but he refused to be intimidated. "I've seen how people here treat each other. How some people are treated differently based on the color of their skin," he continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. "I've experienced it myself, and I know I'm not the only one. It's time for this town to have an honest conversation about racism." A hushed silence followed his words, and for a moment, Marcus wondered if he had gone too far. But then something unexpected happened. The young woman from the grocery store, the one who had defended him, stood up and walked to the front of the room. "I agree with Marcus," she said, her voice clear and resolute. "I've lived here my whole life, and I've seen the way some people are treated because of their race. It's wrong. We can't ignore it anymore." There was a ripple of murmurs through the room, some of surprise, others of discomfort. But the young woman didn't back down. "We need to create a community where everyone feels welcome," she continued, "where race doesn't determine how people are treated. It's time for us to change." For a moment, it seemed like the room might erupt into chaos, but instead, a few more voices joined in. A teacher from the local school stood up, nodding in agreement. A couple of business owners chimed in, expressing their support. Even a few older members of the community, who had once been silent, raised their hands, acknowledging the issue. Marcus felt a spark of hope, a flicker of possibility that maybe, just maybe, change was possible in this town. But not everyone was on board. The older man who had blocked his path in the grocery store, the one who had seemed so uncomfortable, stood up now, his face red with anger. "This is nonsense," he spat, his voice shaking with fury. "We don't have these problems here. You're just stirring up trouble." Marcus could feel the tension in the room rise as the man continued to rant. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some clearly disagreeing with him, others too afraid to speak up. But Marcus wasn't afraid. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to back down now. "Sir," he said, his voice calm but firm, "the problem isn't that people are talking about it. The problem is that we've been ignoring it for too long." The man's face twisted with contempt, but Marcus didn't flinch. The mayor tried to step in, calling for order, but Marcus could see that the damage had already been done. The town was divided, and the conversation had only just begun. As the meeting went on, the discussions became more heated. Some people continued to speak out, others retreated into silence. Marcus listened, taking it all in, knowing that this was just the beginning. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick. But the conversation had started, and for the first time since his arrival, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference. When the meeting finally adjourned, Marcus left the community center feeling a mix of exhaustion and determination. The road ahead would be long, and it would be filled with resistance, but he had taken the first step, and that was all that mattered. The town hall meeting had left Marcus with a heavy heart. but it also sparked something inside him, a determination to keep pushing, to continue challenging the status quo. The day after the meeting, he walked through the streets with a new sense of purpose. It was clear that the road to change would be long, and not everyone was ready to face the uncomfortable truths that had been laid bare. But as he spoke to more people, as he spent time in the community, he noticed something: small shifts. The conversations were starting, even if only in hushed tones. The next week, Marcus was invited to speak at the local high school's career day. The principal, a friendly woman named Mrs. Thompson, had heard about his work and thought he could offer students a new perspective. Marcus was more than willing to participate. He felt that reaching young minds was one of the most important things he could do. It wasn't enough to fight the system from the outside. He needed to help shape the future, to help these kids see the world for what it was and what it could be. On the day of the event, Marcus stood in front of a group of high school juniors and seniors, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apathy. He began his speech, talking about his background as a counselor, the challenges of working in a community with deep-rooted prejudices, and why he believes so strongly in the power of change. "I've seen how hate and fear can keep people from seeing each other as equals," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "But I've also seen how understanding and compassion can break down those walls. And it starts with all of you. You are the future." Some of the students nodded, others shifted in their seats, but Marcus didn't mind. He knew that most of them were hearing words they had never considered before. He could feel the resistance, but he also saw a glimmer of curiosity, a spark of thought in a few of their eyes. After his speech, he opened the floor to questions, and for a few moments, the room was silent. Then, a hand shot up in the front row. It was a young woman with curly hair and a confident demeanor. "Yes," Marcus called out, trying to mask his surprise. He had expected some resistance, but the students' reactions had been surprisingly respectful so far. "What do you think we should do about the people who just don't care?" the girl asked, her voice steady. "The ones who won't listen no matter what you say." Marcus took a deep breath. It was a good question, one that he had asked himself many times over the past few months. "You can't change everyone," he said, meeting her gaze, "but you can change your own actions. You can lead by example. Show people what it means to treat others with respect and kindness. Sometimes, all it takes is one person standing up and saying, 'This isn't right.' That person might be you." The room was quiet for a moment, and Marcus saw a few students exchange glances. There was something different in the air, something hopeful. After the session ended, Mrs. Thompson pulled Marcus aside. "You did great," she said, a smile on her face. "You've given these kids something to think about. Some of them needed to hear that." "I hope they were listening," Marcus replied, watching as the students trickled out of the room. "But I also know this isn't the end. It's just the beginning." The next few days brought a mixture of reactions. Some of the students came up to Marcus after class to ask more questions, to talk about their thoughts on race and prejudice. Others avoided him altogether, unsure of what to make of the conversation he had started. But Marcus wasn't deterred. He had planted the seed, and now it was time to water it. As the weeks passed, he began to notice something strange. The subtle animosity that had plagued him for months seemed to have increased in intensity. The stares were longer, the whispers more frequent. He couldn't pinpoint the exact cause, but something had shifted. People were becoming more vocal about their disdain for him, and he couldn't help but wonder if the meeting at the community center had ignited something in the town that was far darker than he had realized. One afternoon, as Marcus was walking home from the community center, he passed by the same man who had blocked his path in the grocery store a few weeks earlier. This time, the man didn't look at Marcus. With just discomfort, there was a visible sneer on his face. "Still here, huh?" the man called out, his voice dripping with contempt. Marcus stopped, meeting the man's gaze. "Yes," he said calmly, "I'm still here." The man's expression twisted with anger. Why don't you just leave? You're causing trouble in a place that's never needed it. I'm not causing trouble, Marcus replied, his voice steady. I'm here to help. If you don't like it, that's your choice. But I'm not going anywhere. The man took a step closer, his fists clenching at his sides. You don't belong here. People like you. Marcus cut him off before he could finish. People like me? Is that what you think? I'm a person just like you. No different. For a brief moment, it seemed like the man was about to lunge at him, but then he stopped, his eyes burning with frustration. He spat on the ground, a look of disdain still on his face, and turned to walk away. Marcus stood there, his heart racing. He hadn't expected the confrontation to escalate so quickly, but he was proud of himself for standing his ground. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. As the days wore on, the tension in town only seemed to increase. The subtle animosity that had once been a background hum now felt like a loud, oppressive noise. People were taking sides, choosing whether to accept Marcus or reject him, and the rejection was louder than the acceptance. But through it all, Marcus remained resolute. He knew that change wasn't a linear process, and he knew that his presence was shaking things up in ways that would make some uncomfortable. But he wasn't going to stop. Not now, not ever. The weeks that followed were a blur of tension, unspoken words, and fleeting moments of clarity. Marcus could feel the divide in the town growing wider, the lines between those who supported him and those who opposed him becoming more pronounced. It was as though the town had become a battlefield, with each side digging in their heels, unwilling to compromise. But even as the tension rose, Marcus continued his work. He attended meetings, spoke with community leaders, and did his best to offer guidance to those who sought his help. But there were days when it felt like the weight of it all was too much to bear. The constant glares, the whispered insults, the late-night phone calls filled with threats, it all wore on him. There were nights when he lay awake, questioning whether his efforts were truly making a difference, or if he was just another person shouting into the void. One evening, after a particularly difficult day of counseling, Marcus found himself wandering the streets, lost in thought. He didn't want to go home just yet. He needed a break, a moment of peace. As he walked, he found himself standing in front of the grocery store, where it had all started, the place where the old woman had insulted him, the place that had become a symbol of everything wrong with this town. The store looked the same as it always did, quiet, with a few cars parked outside, people coming and going. But to Marcus, it seemed like a fortress, one that stood as a reminder of the walls that had been built around him. He took a deep breath, steeling himself against the emotions that surged within him, and pushed open the door. Inside, the air was cool, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. It wasn't busy, just a few customers wandering the aisles, none of them paying him any mind. He moved quietly through the aisles, gathering a few things he needed. But when he reached the checkout counter, he was met with a familiar face, the young cashier, the same one who had greeted him with barely a nod in the past. "Hey, Marcus," the cashier said with a smile, his tone warmer than usual. "How's it going?" Marcus was taken aback for a moment, surprised by the change in the cashier's demeanor. He smiled back, though it felt somewhat forced. "I'm doing all right. How about you?" "Can't complain," the cashier replied, scanning the items with practiced ease. "I heard about what happened with your car. That's messed up, man. No one should have to deal with that." Marcus paused, his hand resting on the counter. "Thanks. It's been tough, but I'm doing what I can to move forward." The cashier glanced around, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I just want you to know, people around here, they talk, but not everyone feels the way they do. Some of us, we're with you." Marcus felt a swell of emotion rise in his chest, surprise, relief, and something else he couldn't quite name. He hadn't expected support, not from this town, not like this. He nodded slowly, taking in the cashier's words. "Thanks," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "That means a lot." As Marcus left the store, a strange feeling settled in his chest. It wasn't the weight of the town's hatred that he had grown used to, but something different. It was a sense of solidarity, however small, and it was enough to keep him going. The next few days were quiet, but something had shifted. There was a subtle change in the air, a feeling that the people who had been silent were beginning to find their voices. At the next town meeting, a few more people stood up, offering support for the efforts Marcus had started. Some even acknowledged the challenges they had faced in their own lives: racism, bigotry, and intolerance, and how they had struggled to overcome them. But the most surprising moment came when Marcus received an invitation to meet with the mayor once again. This time, it wasn't for a town hall or a public forum, it was a private meeting. Marcus wasn't sure what to expect, but he went. The mayor's office was quiet, the air thick with the weight of unspoken words. Mayor Harper greeted him with a handshake, his expression more serious than usual. "Marcus," the mayor began, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said at the town hall, and I've realized something. You're right, we've been avoiding the issue for far too long." Marcus wasn't sure he had heard correctly. "What do you mean?" The mayor leaned forward, his voice low. "I've been part of the problem. I've seen things, heard things, and I haven't done enough. I've let fear and comfort keep me from doing what's right." Marcus didn't know how to respond. This was the mayor, the man who had avoided confronting these issues head-on, the man who had spent years turning a blind eye to the town's prejudices. "I want to do better," Mayor Harper said, his voice heavy with regret, "and I think it starts with me. I want to work with you. Let's make a real change here, together." For a moment, Marcus just stared at him, processing the words. He had expected resistance, not this. But as he looked into the mayor's eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen before: genuine remorse. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was a start. "I'm willing to give it a try," Marcus said slowly, "but it can't just be talk. It has to be real." The mayor nodded. "I agree. We'll need to work together, not just as leaders, but as people who want to see this town become better. I'm ready to take that step. Are you?" Marcus took a deep breath, his mind racing. This was the moment he had been waiting for. It wasn't going to be perfect. There would still be obstacles, still be people who resisted. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't fighting alone. "Yes," Marcus said, his voice steady. "I'm ready." And so, the work began. The road to change would be long, and there would be setbacks. But Marcus knew that with every small victory, they were getting closer to a future where people like him, people of color, people who had been silenced, would be seen and heard. As Marcus left the mayor's office, the weight that had been pressing on his chest for so long seemed a little lighter. The journey was far from over, but now it felt possible. The change he had fought for, the change he had dreamed of, was no longer just a dream. It was real.